I have thought many times about what I should have felt in that gallery. Pride, perhaps. Or the cold satisfaction of a trap sprung cleanly after 3 years of patience. What I actually felt, standing with my hands resting on the marble rail and watching the compact's chamber floor fill with the kind of noise that bodies make when they realize something irreversible has happened, was very close to nothing. A flat, finished quiet inside my chest. The way a room sounds after the last ember goes out. That is where the story ends, of course. The chamber, the dome, the fleet hanging in the pale sky above the compact's spire, like a second ceiling. None of them had been told to expect. But stories don't live in their endings. They live in the machinery that makes the ending inevitable, the slow accumulation of decisions, theirs and ours, that locks a door years before anyone bothers to check whether it is locked. So I will start at the beginning, or close enough to it. My name is Elia Voss. I was at the time of the compact vote, the senior intelligence attaché for the Terran Diplomatic Commission, attached to the delegation of Provisional Envoy Hadron Sale. I had held the position for 11 years. Before that, I worked in strategic assessment for the Commission's field office on Veth Station, and before that, I spent 4 years as a junior analyst in a basement annex on the Commission's home campus, where the ceiling leaked mineral brown water whenever it rained, and the coffee machine had been broken since before I arrived, and nobody ever fixed it. I mention this not to establish credentials, but to explain something about temperament. 11 years in intelligence work, 4 years before that, in a basement that smelled of damp concrete and institutional patience. You learn to read a room not for what it is saying, for what is already decided. You learn to wait. The compact was called the Interstellar Compact of Sovereign Worlds, though nobody used the full name except in formal documents and condemnation orders. 9 species, 11 systems, 1 chamber in the capital complex on Vareth Prime, a tiered amphitheater beneath a glass dome the size of a parade ground, built when the compact was young and optimistic about the amount of light the future would require. The dome let in daylight from Vareth's pale yellow sun in long diagonal columns that shifted across the curved tiers as the day moved. In the early sessions, it gave the chamber a quality of warmth, almost ecclesiastical. By the afternoon, when the sun had moved around and the columns came in low and flat, it made the tiers look like they were carved from bone. We had been observers in the compact for 6 years before the vote. Not members. The membership application had been under review for 4 of those 6 years, delayed each time by procedural amendment and what the compact's liaison officers called administrative recalibration meant they were not sure yet what category to put us in. Species that arrived from a single system origin, without a colonial network behind them and without a patron species to vouch for them, fell into a gap in the compact's taxonomy. We were not yet classified. We were not yet threatening. We were for 6 years, a curiosity that sat in the gallery and submitted reports and waited. I want to be clear about what 6 years of that does to a delegation. It does not make you angry. Anger requires the belief that the situation might be otherwise, that a different outcome was available and was denied to you. After 6 years in that gallery, we understood with great precision that the compact had no intention of granting membership to a species it had not yet finished categorizing, and that the categorization process would continue to expand, to fill the time available to it, because that was how the pact worked. Categorization was not an administrative function, it was a holding pen. We understood this. We sat in the gallery and we were patient and we did our work. The work, in my case, was the kind that does not appear in session transcripts. I attended the formal sessions in the gallery, took notes, filed assessments, but the more consequential part of my portfolio was structural, mapping the compact's defense architecture, its command protocols, its resupply networks, the precise communication handshake sequences that each of the 11 member systems used to authenticate requests from the central defense grid. The compact maintained a shared defense grid, a network of orbital platforms, relay stations, response algorithms that member systems could invoke in case of external threat. It was the compact's primary military deterrent. It was also, when I finished mapping it, one of the most thoroughly documented systems in my division's files. I want to be precise about how we came to hold those authentication codes. 3 years before the vote, the compact admitted a 12th species, the Thessary, from a binary system in the outer arm, and, in the administrative reorganization that followed, the Commission's legal team petitioned successfully for observer status at the Security Architecture Review. Not membership in the review, observer status. A seat in the room where the updated authentication protocols were being distributed to member systems so that compact-adjacent observers could coordinate emergency communications, if needed. Petition was approved by a procedural committee on a day when 3 of its 9 members were absent. Do not believe anyone on that committee considered the implications carefully. We were a curiosity. Curiosities do not take notes that matter. We took very careful notes. I will not pretend this was passive. We knew what we were doing. The Commission's position at that point was that the compact's categorization delay was structural and deliberate. That membership would not be granted regardless of what we submitted, and that the only question remaining was what to do about it. The answer that Director General Asta Crane arrived at, after 2 months of closed sessions with the Commission's full council, was the following. We would stay in the gallery. We would continue to observe. We would continue to file reports. We would spend the intervening time making sure that if the compact ever decided that the correct response to an unclassified species was not categorization but elimination, the cost of that decision would be prohibitive. Preferably, Director General Crane said, more prohibitive than the compact had ever conceived of paying. The fleet was not new when it arrived over Vareth Prime. It had been assembled over 3 years in the orbital dockyards above Keth Station, outside compact space, in quiet increments that our shipbuilding registries recorded as commercial tonnage and infrastructure maintenance. 18 capital vessels, 62 support craft, 4 dedicated electronic warfare platforms that had no analog in the compact's vessel classification database, which was, I will note the point. The electronic warfare platforms were specifically designed to interface with the compact's defense grid using the authentication codes we had documented at the Security Architecture Review. They were not weapons, strictly speaking. They were keys, very large keys, built into the hulls of vessels that could, if required, be weapons. The fleet arrived in compact space 11 days before the vote, not on the day of the vote, 11 days prior, in formation under full cloaking systems, traveling at a speed and on a vector that brought it to a position approximately 40,000 kilometers above Vareth Prime. By the morning of the session, cloaked, silent, holding station, waiting for a signal from the gallery. I was the signal. Let me describe the chamber on the morning of the vote, because the physical reality of it matters. I had been in that gallery for 6 years. I knew the chamber the way you know a place you have spent too long in. Not fondly, but precisely. The way you know the exact creak of a floorboard you have stepped on 10,000 times. The tiers rose in a steep curve from the chamber floor, separated by species into designated sections. 9 species, 9 sections, each with its own sigil cut into the marble above the seating rows. The human section was in the gallery, above and behind the main tiers. Because we were observers, and observers did not sit on the floor, we had 4 seats. On the morning of the vote I sat in the leftmost one. Provisional Envoy Hadron Sale to my right and 2 junior attaches behind us. Hadron was a careful man. 61 years old, 12 years in the diplomatic service, before that a career in structural engineering that had given him a particular way of looking at load-bearing. Always asking where the stress was going. Always looking for the joint that was taking more weight than it was designed for. He wore his hair short and his suits gray, and he had a habit when he was thinking, pressing his thumb and forefinger together, and then releasing them. A small rhythmic gesture that I had watched for 6 years without ever asking him about it. On the morning of the vote he was very still. The finger gesture had stopped. That told me more than anything else in the chamber. The arch-speaker that morning was Councillor Pereth Un, a senior representative from the Thurvian delegation, one of the compact's founding species, elongated limbs and a voice that resonated at a register low enough to vibrate the bench if you sat at the front of the gallery. Pereth Un had been on the compact's floor for 22 years. I had read his session transcripts going back 11 years. He was precise, politically cautious, and fundamentally incurious about anything that had not already been categorized. He was, in other words, perfect instrument for what the compact was about to do. The vote had been on the agenda for 3 months. I had known it was coming for longer than that. 14 months to be exact. From the moment, a junior analyst in my division flagged a set of internal compact communications, suggesting that a working group had been formed to address the question of unclassified observer species. The language of those communications, when I read them, was not the language of administrative review. It was the language of resolution. Something was going to be decided. When I dug further, I found the proposal, a formal mechanism by which the compact could rescind an observer status and impose a full interdiction order, cutting the affected species off from trade networks, communication relays, and compact adjacent space. The proposal had been drafted 18 months earlier. It had been sitting in committee since then, being quietly refined. The thing about an interdiction order in the compact's legal framework was that it was essentially terminal. A species under full interdiction could not access the relay networks, could not use the jump lanes, not trade with any of the 11 member systems, all of whom had signed economic integration agreements that made trading with an interdicted species an expellable offense. An interdiction order was not a declaration of war, technically. It was something the compact considered more civilized. A slow removal of the conditions of existence, conducted through paperwork, that left the affected species isolated and contracting while the compact's member worlds moved on. The assumption, I believe, was that a species without colonial territory and without a patron would simply reach a point of diminishing capability and quietly cease to be a problem. The assumption was, to use a word I have always found useful, wrong. I sat in the gallery and I listened to Parath read the preamble of the interdiction proposal. The preamble was long. That was by design. The compact's formal procedures required that any measure affecting an observer species be read in full before the vote, a courtesy that had been established for the benefit of the affected party, so that they understood what was happening to them. We understood what was happening to us. We had understood it for 14 months. But the compact's procedures required the reading, so Parath read, and the chamber listened, and I sat in the gallery with my hands on the marble rail and waited. The chamber's floor was full, all 9 species represented, all tiers occupied. There was a particular quality to the attention in the room, not the careful quiet of a difficult decision, but the settled attention of a body that had already made up its mind and was now completing the ceremony. The Thurvian block, the largest, sat in their curved section with the particular stillness of species that can control their peripheral musculature independently and choose not to. A kind of cultivated calm that I had come to recognize as the Thurvian equivalent of crossing your arms. The Karathi, 4-limbed and blue-skinned, sat in 2 rows above the Thurvians and showed no reaction at all, which was also a reaction. The Mahesi, smallest of the 9 species and the most procedurally precise, had their representative at the edge of her tier making very small marks on a tablet, documenting the vote, I assumed. Recording for the archive. I thought about the archive. The compact maintained a biological and intelligence archive on every species it had classified. The archive was comprehensive, had been built to be comprehensive, and the member species trusted it, the way institutions trust their own records. Completely, without verification, because the alternative was to admit that the database might contain errors, and institutions do not easily admit that. The Commission's Intelligence Division had spent 4 years cross-referencing the compact's archive entries against our own data. We found, on the human entry, 7 significant errors, not minor ones. Errors that systematically understated our shipbuilding capacity, our resource extraction rate, our population distribution, and our technological development curve. The errors were not malicious, as far as we could determine. They were the errors of a body that had glanced at an unfamiliar thing and made assumptions, and then entered those assumptions into a database, and then stopped looking. 7 errors. 14 months of knowing an interdiction order was coming. 3 years of cloaked fleet assembly. 11 days of a fleet sitting 40,000 kilometers overhead, while the compact's instruments showed nothing but a clean sky. Parath finished the preamble. His voice dropped to its normal register, which still resonated in the bench, and he asked the chamber to signal its vote. I watched the light panels at the edge of each section change. The voting system used a chromatic display. The amber of approval lit each tier in turn, starting with the Thurvians, then the Karathi, then the Mahesi, working around the curve of the chamber. Not unanimous. The Jasari delegation withheld, which was interesting, and which I noted in my assessment file, and which did not change the outcome. 8 of 9 species approved. Proposal passed. There was noise. Not celebration, exactly. The compact was too procedurally restrained for celebration, but a quality of settled rightness. The sound a room makes, when it believes it has done the necessary thing. Parath raised a hand for quiet and began reading the formal decree. The decree was shorter than the preamble. It named the species. It named the grounds. It specified the interdiction terms. Trade suspension, relay access revoked. Jump lane access denied to vessels registered under Terran registry, with immediate effect upon the decree's completion. He read our name from the paper. I pressed my thumb against the underside of the gallery rail. A small downward pressure, not visible from the chamber floor. I had arranged 3 days earlier, with the technical officer on the fleet's command vessel. Signal would be transmitted this mid via a tight beam relay from a small device built into the rail's underside by a commissioned technician, posing as a maintenance worker during one of the gallery's routine inspection windows. The tight beam relay would take 11 seconds to reach the fleet at that distance. I pressed and released and waited. Parath read on. He had perhaps 2 more paragraphs of the decree remaining. The floor of the chamber remained quiet in that particular settled way. Hadron Sale sat to my right without moving. The 2 junior attachés behind us sat without moving. In the compact's gallery, which was the designated space for observers and therefore contained, that morning, representatives from 3 unclassified species, there was a quality of held breath that I suspect Parath interpreted as resignation. He was wrong about that too. The dome above the chamber was structural glass, 40 meters above the floor at its highest point, curved in a shallow arc that allowed daylight to fall evenly across all tiers. On a clear morning on Vareth Prime, the sky through the dome was a pale blue-gray, Vareth's color lighter than Earth's sky, more metallic in quality, as if it were made of something thinner. In the mornings, when the sun was still low, you could see the city's upper tower lines through the dome, and sometimes the angular shapes of orbital transports running their descent lanes toward the port complex to the south. I know what the dome looked like at the moment the cloak dropped, because I was watching it. The first ship was not the largest. It was one of the support craft, a mid-weight vessel, angular, without visible armament, running at low speed on a holding orbit that brought it directly above the dome as the fleet's cloaking systems disengaged in sequence. The sequence took approximately 40 seconds from first to last. The first ship appeared as a shadow against the pale sky, a dark angular shape that resolved, in the dome's glass, into the unmistakable silhouette of a human vessel. Then another. Then, as the larger ships released their cloaking fields, the shapes began to overlap. Capital vessels, broad and flat-keeled, positioned in a formation that covered the sky above the chamber from one edge of the dome to the other. I want to be clear about what I mean when I say covered. The dome was 40 meters across at its widest. The fleet's capital vessels were each 300 meters along their primary axis. The 18 capital vessels, arranged in their holding formation, did not individually cover the dome. What they did was occupy the visible sky above the dome in a quantity and proximity that made the pale blue-gray of Vareth's atmosphere invisible. The sky had been replaced. Where there had been pale light, there were hulls. The chamber floor noticed in pieces. I have reconstructed this from the session transcript later, which continued recording through the subsequent events. The compact's recording systems ran automatically, stopping only on a direct override command from the Archspeaker's podium. And Parath did not issue that command, because by the time the command would have been appropriate to issue, he was no longer at the podium. He had, by that point, moved to the edge of the Thurchian section and appeared to be attempting to access a communication terminal on the tier wall. I do not know what he was attempting to communicate or to whom. All communications from the chamber complex had, by the time the cloak dropped, been rerouted through the fleet's electronic warfare platforms, which had authenticated themselves to the compact's communication relay network, using the codes I had documented 3 years earlier. The fleet was not blocking communications. It was sitting between the chamber and whatever the communications were supposed to reach. The noise on the floor began with the species whose auditory range is broader than the Thurvians. The Karathi heard the vibration change in the ventilation system first, which is a detail I found in the session transcript later, and have never been entirely sure what to make of, whether it was the vibration of large hulls at low orbit, or something else in the system responding. 3 Karathi representatives stood. The standing drew attention. The attention turned upward, as attention in a domed chamber tends to when something interrupts the sky. First sound was not a shout. It was something lower, a collective intake, a compression of air across a room full of beings who had all, at the same moment, registered that the sky was wrong. Then the sound climbed. I stood up from the gallery bench. I want to be precise here, because the precision matters. I did not stand dramatically. I did not stand with the intention of being observed. I stood because we had been sitting in that gallery for 6 years, and I was finished sitting, and standing felt correct. I straightened my jacket, a habit, something to do with my hands, and I picked up my briefing folder from the bench beside me, and I walked along the gallery row toward the exit stair. Hadron Sale stood at the same moment without looking at me and followed. 2 junior attachés fell in behind. The gallery exit was on the chamber's southern wall, behind the observer seating, a door of heavy paneled material that led to a corridor and then to the building's main external access. I had walked through that door perhaps 200 times in 6 years. I walked through it again at a measured pace, while behind me the chamber floor was becoming something I no longer needed to watch. Corridor outside the chamber was wide and low-ceilinged compared to the chamber itself, one of those transitional spaces that institutions build, without thinking carefully about, functional and slightly dingy, lit by long panels that gave the stonework a yellowish cast. A pair of compact administrative staff were in the corridor when we emerged, moving quickly toward the chamber's service entrance, with the urgent posture of people who have just been told something they need to respond to, and have not yet been told what the response should be. They passed us without stopping. We walked at our own pace. The building's main atrium was 3 flights down, a wide space with a high ceiling, and the compact's founding sigil in the floor mosaic, 9 interlocking shapes in colored stone that I had thought, on first seeing it years ago, was a beautiful piece of design. I still thought so. Institutions can produce beautiful things, and still be wrong about the essential questions. The atrium had a set of large exterior doors, glass and metal, that opened onto the complex's public approach. A broad walkway flanked by the species sigils cut into standing stones, running down to the transit plaza, where the commission's transport was waiting. We crossed the atrium without stopping, and went through the doors. Outside, the light was wrong. Not the warm, pale light of a normal Varith morning, filtered, dimmed, as if something had come between the city and the sun. I looked up. The fleet was visible from the ground without optical equipment. 18 capital vessels at low orbit do not require magnification. They were present in the sky the way clouds are present, not individual objects, to be examined but a weight, a fact, the understanding that the sky above this city was no longer unclaimed space. I stood on the approach walkway for perhaps 30 seconds. Not waiting, there was nothing to wait for. More what I described earlier as the flat, finished quiet. The feeling of a thing completed that had been in process for 3 years, and which now existed in the world as a material fact, which is different from existing as a plan. Hadron Sale came to stand beside me. He was looking up. "Clean acquisition," he said. His voice was the same register it always was. Not triumphant, not relieved. "A structural engineer's assessment. Clean," I agreed. We went to the transport. I want to describe what happened in the chamber in the period following our departure, because this is, in the end, the story, not what we did, what the compact did with what we had done. The session transcript, which I was given access to in the months following, as part of the post-incident documentation process, runs for 4 hours and 17 minutes after the moment of decloak. First 40 minutes are difficult to follow, because the recording captures the chamber floor in full audio, and the chamber floor for those 40 minutes was not producing coherent deliberation. What it was producing was the sound of an institution confronting a situation it did not have a protocol for. The compact had protocols for a great many things. The years I had spent mapping their administrative structure had given me a thorough understanding of where their protocols were comprehensive and where they had gaps, and the situation they were now in. A cloaked fleet appearing over their capital, belonging to a species whose observer status had just been voted out, a fleet that was not firing, not communicating, not making demands, simply being present in the sky, fell into a gap that their protocols had not anticipated. They had anticipated hostility. There were protocols for hostility, a threat declaration, an approach vector, a vessel that powered weapons, a species that sent demands, protocols for retreat. There were no protocols, as far as I could find in the documentation, for a fleet that simply appeared and waited. The waiting was the point. It had taken us 3 years to understand what the compact was going to do, and another 3 years to build the fleet. And all of that time we had been in the gallery, watching the compact's procedures. The thing about watching an institution's procedures for 6 years is that you come to understand what frightens it more than anything else. The compact was not, at its foundation, afraid of enemies. Enemies were categorized. Enemies had protocols. What the compact was afraid of, the thing its procedures were built to prevent, was not knowing what was happening. Classification existed because the unknown was intolerable. The categorization delays, the working groups, the years of administrative recalibration, all of it was the compact trying to place us in a box it could understand. What we had done, by building the fleet in registered commercial tonnage categories and bringing it to Vareth cloaked and silent, and outside their instruments, capacity to detect, was demonstrate that the box was wrong. That they had been wrong about us for 6 years and had built their policies on those errors. The fleet did not fire. I want to be clear about this. 18 capital vessels, 62 support craft, 4 electronic warfare platforms. None of them discharged a weapon at any point during the operation. The electronic warfare platforms had, at the moment of decloak, completed their authentication sequence with the compact's defense grid and assumed supervisory access. Not control, supervisory access, which in the compact's architecture meant they were positioned between the grid's command layer and its execution layer. Any order issued from compact command would pass through the platforms before reaching the grid's response systems. Platforms were not issuing countermands. They were inserting a delay. 44 seconds. That was the delay they inserted. 44 seconds between a compact command and the grid's response. In practical terms, this meant the compact's defense grid was operational, technically, on paper. But between the intention and the execution, there was now a gap wide enough to drive a fleet through. The compact's military command, housed in a separate complex 3 kilometers from the chamber, spent the first hour attempting to navigate this gap, cycling commands through alternate authentication channels, attempting to revoke the platform's access. The platforms had anticipated each alternate channel. The authentication codes covered everyone. The session transcript shows that it was approximately an hour and 40 minutes after decloak that the chamber floor achieved something resembling deliberation. By that point, Prathun had returned to the podium, which I believe required effort. The transcript shows he left the podium area twice in the intervening time, once to the communication terminal, and once for a period of 17 minutes, during which the session recording shows only the ambient sound of the chamber in full deliberative disorder. When he returned the second time, he called for silence in the procedural manner, and the chamber complied, because institutions default to procedure when they do not know what else to do. Followed was a discussion that the post-incident documentation describes as an emergency security assessment. What it actually was, from the transcript, was the compact's floor spending an hour and a half reaching a conclusion that anyone in the gallery could have told them on the next morning. The fleet had not come to attack. If it had come to attack, it would have attacked. It was doing something more uncomfortable than attacking. It was demonstrating. Specifically, it was demonstrating the distance between what the compact had believed about us and what was actually true. The Mahesi representative, Counselor Seth Maharan, one of the compact's more analytically precise members, session transcripts I had read with considerable respect over the years, was the first member of the floor to articulate this clearly. About 2 hours in, she stood at her tier and said, in the precise and quietly devastating way that was characteristic of her species, that the fleet above the dome was not a military instrument. It was a proof. It was a proof of 7 specific errors in the compact's human archive, and until the compact addressed those errors, any response it issued would be built on the same foundation as the decision that had produced this situation. The chamber received this without argument. The session transcript shows no challenge to it. The compact had run out of arguments, or rather, the argument it would have made. That the human archive was accurate, that the fleet was impossible, that was not what it appeared to be, was demonstrably unavailable now. The proof was parked 40,000 kilometers above their heads. Counselor then moved that the interdiction decree, which had been read but not yet formally filed with the compact's legal registry, be referred to the Procedural Review Council before filing. Under the compact's rules, a decree under procedural review could not be filed. Under the compact's rules, a decree not filed within 90 standard days of its reading expired. The motion passed. 6 of the 8 approving species voted for the referral. The Thurvians and the Karathi abstained. The interdiction decree, in the event, was never filed. I learned all of this later. On the day itself, I was in the Commission's transport vehicle, heading toward the secondary departure port, because the main port had suspended all departures pending the situation assessment, and the Commission's logistics team had arranged a secondary port departure clearance 3 days earlier, in case the main port went into lockdown. We had anticipated a great many things. The transport was a standard Commission model, nothing remarkable. Seating for 6 and a cargo section at the rear. Hadron sat across from me. The 2 junior attachés sat at the rear. Nobody talked for the first half hour. Outside the transport windows, the city of Varith's capital moved past in its ordinary morning way. The street level of any large city looks the same in the morning. The deliveries and the early foot traffic and the particular quality of light that has not yet been argued with by the day. Above the city's rooflines, if you looked up through the transport skylight, you could see the fleet's shapes in the morning sky. But at street level, nobody appeared to be looking up. Or perhaps they were, and the transport was moving too quickly for me to see their faces. At the secondary port, the departure was routine. Re-checks were processed by an automated system that did not know or care about what had happened in the chamber. The Commission's vessel, a mid-weight registered transport, nothing military, nothing that would prompt a scan, was cleared for departure within 40 minutes of our arrival. The port's orbital clearance system, which interfaced with the compact's defense grid, issued our departure vector without complication. The fleet's platforms, when our vessel's ID appeared in the clearance queue, added a verification code to our registration packet, a small digital annotation that told the beach response systems that this vessel was under fleet protection, standard clearance, +1 annotation. We departed on schedule. I sat at a viewport on the departure arc and watched Varith Prime fall away below us. The planet from altitude is rust-colored in its continental shelves, greener at the poles, with a cloud cover that on that morning was patchy enough to see the capital complex through. A white geometric scar in the rust-colored plain, and above it, dimming as we gained distance, the shapes of the fleet at their holding stations. I thought about the 3 years, the dockyards, the codes, the careful accumulation of a capability that the compact's archive did not know to look for because they had stopped looking. 7 errors in a database that an institution had trusted completely. 7 errors that had produced a working group, which had produced a proposal, had produced a vote, which had produced a morning that the compact's floor was going to be working through for a very long time. I was tired. Not the tiredness of a bad night's sleep, a deeper tiredness, the kind that accumulates over years of patient, careful work in a gallery that does not acknowledge your presence except to note it in the observer's registry. Tired in the way that comes after a long thing is finished. I recognized it as the feeling that would eventually, given time and sleep, and several weeks away from anything that required a session transcript, resolve into something like rest. I was not there yet. I could see the path. Hadron came to sit in the adjacent seat. For several minutes he was quiet, looking at the viewport the same way he had been looking up at the fleet from the approach walkway. Structural engineer habit. Looking for where the weight is going, where the joint is stressed, what had broken, and where. The Jasari voted no, I said. He nodded. He had noticed. I want to reach out to Jasari liaison when we're clear, I said. Before the commission sends the formal communication, I think there's a conversation to be had. He thought about this. Leave it 2 days. Let them have a day to process internally, then reach out. 2 days, I agreed. That was the extent of it. The compact had passed a vote, and then had to live inside the consequences of that vote. And we were going to leave in a transport, with a fleet protection annotation on our departure registry, and 2 days of thinking time before the first conversation that would begin to untangle what came next. This is how these things work. The dramatic events are the surface. The surface lasts for an hour. Underneath, the patient machinery runs for years, before and after. I want to say something about the fleet, because the fleet deserves precision. We did not build it as a weapon. I know how that sounds, given what I have described. 18 capital vessels, electronic warfare platforms, the authentication codes, the defense grid access, the sky above the compact's chamber filled with hulls. I know it does not look like something that was not a weapon. But the fleet was never designed to fire. Director General Crane had been explicit about this in the closed sessions, in a way that I believe was both principled and practical, because the two things were not in conflict. The principled reason was that we had not come to the compact to destroy it. We had come to be recognized by it, to participate in it, to be given the standing in galactic political life that 6 years of observation and 3 rejected membership applications had not produced. Destroying the institution we wanted to join was not consistent with the goal. The practical reason was that the compact was right to be cautious about unknown species. The precautionary instinct was correct even if the response to it was wrong, and a fleet that fired would prove the compact's fears rather than disproving them. We needed to disprove them. We needed to demonstrate that the archive was wrong, and that the thing the archive was wrong about was not our capability to harm them, but our nature. We were not what they thought. We were capable of something they had not classified: restraint, at scale, under provocation, over years. The fleet was a proof. Counselor Seth Maharan had said so in the chamber, and she was correct. And I would have told her so if the opportunity had ever arisen, which it eventually did. 3 months later, she was the compact's designated point of contact for the re-engagement process, and we sat across from each other in a small conference room in a neutral orbital station with 2 mugs of something warm and a great deal of ground to cover, she said, in the way that the Mahesi say things that are uncomfortable, directly and without ornament. You understood what we were going to do before we did. 18 months before, I said. She received this, small pause. The working group's communications were secured. They were, yes. Another pause. How many errors did you find in the archive? 7 significant ones. I can provide the documentation. We'd like to work with your archivists to correct the record. She looked at me for a moment, with the particular expression I had come to recognize as Mahesi assessment, the careful pause before a conclusion. What is your word, she said, for a strategy that wins without fighting? About the dockyards, the gallery, the coffee machine in the basement annex that had been broken for 4 years and that I had never been there to see fixed, but that I had always assumed was eventually fixed. Because things like that eventually get fixed if the institution that owns insists long enough. I thought about Director General Crane and the closed sessions. I thought about Hadron's thumb and forefinger gesture, stopped on the morning of the vote. Patience, I said. Usually we just call it patience. She wrote something on her tablet and did not tell me what it was. The re-engagement process took 2 years. It was, in its way, harder than the 3 years before the vote. 3 years of building had a clear product, A measurable output, fleet that either existed or did not. Diplomacy is different. Diplomacy is the accumulation of small adjustments in how two parties understand each other, none of which are visible in the moment, and all of which become visible, eventually, when you look at the distance traveled. The Jesseri were the first full member species to formally request direct engagement with the Commission. As I had expected, as 2 days of thinking time before the outreach call had suggested they might. The Thurvians were last. Harith was not part of that conversation. He had withdrawn from active session participation in the months after the vote, which the Compact's records categorized as a voluntary transition, and which I did not examine more closely than that. The membership application was approved, on the 4th submission, in the 31st month after the vote, not by the full chamber. The Karathi continued to abstain, which the Compact's rules permitted to be treated as a non-objection on matters of species classification. 8 of 9 species voting in support. The same 8 that had voted for the interdiction decree, with the difference being that this time the vote was for admission rather than erasure, and the fleet above the dome was no longer there. It had withdrawn to Keth Station 3 weeks after the vote, once the procedural review made clear the interdiction decree would not be filed. The withdrawal was quiet, no announcement. The fleet simply left the orbit it had been holding, in the same sequence it had arrived. Electronic warfare platforms first, then support craft, then the capital vessels, one by one, back to their departure vector. The Compact's instruments tracked the departure. It was not cloaked. We had no reason to cloak the withdrawal. We were leaving because the point had been made, and staying would have made a different point, and the different point was not the one we wanted to make. I was not there for the withdrawal. I had left Vareth on the morning of the vote, and I did not return for 8 months. The 8 months were spent in commission offices and in the subsequent investigation reviews. Because an operation of that scale, fleet assembly, cloaking transit through mapped space, authentication code acquisition, defense grid access, generates a substantial amount of paperwork. Paperwork is a thing I have always been suited for. I find it grounding. The record of what happened, assembled in careful order, dates and coordinates, and precise capability specifications. The distance between what the Compact's archive had said we were, and what the PERD showed we were, laid out in a document that would eventually be filed in both archives, theirs and ours. The 7 errors, corrected, archived in the Compact's central database, in the 14th month of the re-engagement process. I was present for the archival session as a commission observer. The Compact's chief archivist, a Mhesi of considerable seniority, who gave you the impression of finding all documentation, corrections faintly distressing on principle, as if the original had been correct, and the correction was the aberration, read each correction aloud, and then formally entered it into the record. The session took 3 hours and 40 minutes. It was not dramatic. No one came to watch it. It was the kind of session that is important, precisely because it is not dramatic. Because it is the quiet work of adjusting what is known, which is always slower and less visible than the moment of discovery. I attended every hour of it. When the last entry was filed, the chief archivist looked at me across the table with the expression of someone who has finished a task and is not certain what the task was for. I understood this expression. I had made it myself, in basements, after long nights with documents that mattered. Complete, she said. Complete, I agreed. The admission ceremony was held in the same chamber. The same dome, the same tiers, the same pale daylight coming in from Vareth's sun, which had moved around by the afternoon, so the columns came in low and flat, and the tiers looked like they were carved from bone. I sat in the commission's seats on the floor. Not the gallery, not the observer row above and behind the tiers, but the floor, curved table that was reserved for new member species at the moment of their admission. Hadron sat beside me, as he had in the gallery for 6 years at my right. The 2 junior attachés were there, and Director General Crane, who had traveled from the Commission's home station for the occasion. Parith was not in the chamber. His successor as the Thurvian block's arch-speaker, a younger representative, precise and cautious in a different register from his predecessor, read the admission decree. The language of the admission decree, is different from the language of an interdiction. Where interdiction is a removing, admission is a naming, a formal declaration that a thing exists in the structure, has standing, occupies a recognized place. The decree named us. It named our system. It named the rights and obligations of membership, which are considerable and which I had been studying for months. When the vote was and the lights changed to amber, Councillor Seth Moran caught my eye from across the chamber. Not a smile. The Mahesi face is structured differently and does not produce what we would call a smile in the same configuration, but something in the set of her expression that I had come to read over months of working meetings as acknowledgement, the recognition of a piece of work completed. I looked back at her steadily. Then I looked up at the dome. The sky above it was the pale blue-gray of a Varith afternoon, clear, unoccupied, the kind of sky that has nothing in it except light. The sun was behind the building's roofline by that hour, and the dome was lit by its own internal panels, so the glass showed the city's upper architecture, and beyond it the clean, empty sky. I looked at it for a long moment, the sky where the fleet had been, which was now just Skyfleet, which was, I supposed, the point. Everything had already been decided, 3 years before anyone in that chamber understood there was a decision being made. That is the nature of the kind of work I have spent my life doing. The moment that looks like the turning point, the decloak, the amber lights, corridor where the administrative staff passed us without stopping, is never the moment the thing was decided. The thing was decided in the quiet before, in the dockyards, in the basement annex, in the gallery, session after session, year after year, taking notes that the compact did not know mattered. When the decree finished, Dr. General Crane leaned toward me and said something in a low voice. I did not catch the exact words. The chamber was rising around us, the particular sound of an institution returning to motion after a formal moment. But I think it was something like well done. It might have been something else. He is not a man who says things twice, which means you tend to catch them the first time or not at all. I caught it, or I think I did. It was enough. The chambers filled with the sound of a body in motion, 9 species, all talking in their own registers, the Karathi's low subsonic undertone, and the Mhesi's precise clipped syllables, and the Thurvian's resonant bass, and all the others layered over each other, the way these rooms always sound when something has been completed. And everyone has something to say about it. I sat in the chair for a moment longer and let the sound fill in around me. The flat, finished quiet was gone. That was the difference. On the morning of the vote, I had stood on the approach walkway in a silence that was really the silence of a thing achieved, a task concluded, a lever pulled. This was different. This was the sound of something opening rather than closing, the beginning of the particular kind of long work that does not end in a single session or a single document or a single fleet appearing in the sky, cumulates, year over year, in the record of how 2 parties came to understand each other. I was ready for it. I had been patient for a long time, and patience, it turns out, is a skill that transfers. I up my briefing folder and stood and followed Director General Crane toward the reception floor, and behind me the chamber filled with voices, and above it the dome let in the pale afternoon light of a sky that was nothing but sky. We had earned that sky, not in the morning of the vote, not in the 40 seconds of decloak, not in the hour the chamber floor spent finding its footing in a room whose sky had been rearranged. We had earned it in the years before, in the work that does not appear in session transcripts, in the patience of people who understood that the decisive moment is never the one the room is watching. It was earned in a basement annex with a broken coffee machine, in a gallery with 4 observer seats, in a dry dock above Keth Station, where ships were registered as commercial tonnage, and nobody looked twice. The compact would learn to look twice. That was also part of what we were owed, and in time they gave it to us. Not as a courtesy, but as the consequence of understanding at last, for what we were.